So this session will go through a range of mostly visual sources that can be used in your research for fashion cultures, as well as other modules. And these are the kinds of sources that fashion scholars draw on in their research. Some of them are images made to showcase fashion. Others involve clothing and style by default, because representations of people also involve their bodies and how those bodies are, usually clothed and decorated. The range of sources you can draw on in your fashion research is just vast. And what we're really keen on is that you liberate yourself from Google Image and so on, and explore and find sources in other ways. So, fashion studies is a rich and vibrant area of academic study. Many books are published every year, which contribute to the understanding of how fashion and dress operate as cultural expressions and practices, past and present. Very often, academic writing will give an historical context to whatever it is concerned with. So, history, therefore, is a very important aspect of fashion studies. We can't understand the present without an understanding of the past. And this is why many of the examples I will show you are historical. And, as you will know, history is a key source of inspiration for fashion designers and brands. So knowledge of fashion history is therefore really important for design students. So in this presentation, I am not going to go into any depth in analysis of each of the images I'm showing you. The point is more to give you a broad overview of the range of sources available to you, where to find them, and some of the considerations you will need to make when analysing them. So, primary versus secondary sources, I thought I would clarify this distinction from early on because students get a bit stuck on this difference between primary and secondary sources. Saying that, there are actual grey areas where a source can be used either as a primary or a secondary source. I don't want you to worry too much about that. The point is that you need both. So primary sources are sources that you are interpreting and analysing firsthand. So you are drawing on your interpretation and analysis of a source. And these can be created by yourself. So for example, it could be an interview you've conducted, but it typically will be documents that are created by others. And I'm going to go through a range of those today. So film footage, images, letters, diaries, etc. So secondary sources, though, are also essential in research. So sources we are drawing on someone else's, ideally expert research, analysis, or opinion. So these are typically academic books, articles, or documentaries. So here you are incorporating someone else's, or really the author's, expertise into your argument. So most of the primary sources you will encounter will probably be visual, but not all, and most of the secondary sources tend to be written, but again, not all. So for example, a BBC documentary about Queen Victoria will be a secondary source because the documentary has been researched, created and edited and presented to you as an audience. So, first of all, fashion historians use objects of dress as a primary source. And the ways in which objects can be read and analysed is a whole session in itself. So I'm hoping to do this session next term, or if not, next academic year. And I usually do this session in connection with a field trip where we get our students, we go up to the St Fagans Museum of Social History and explore their dress collections. So many people don't know that St Fagans have one of the best dress collections in Wales, if not the UK. But for this week, we're going to be focusing mostly on two-dimensional image-based primary sources, such as paintings, prints, or drawings. So researching the history of fashion means that the sort of sources you have available depends on the available technologies at the time. So therefore, paintings, prints and drawings are invaluable sources, particularly before the invention of photography. But of course, each artwork must be read in the context of its period, the artist, sitter, and its audience, as well as the context of the type of image it is, whether it's a painting or a print, let's say. But just as in a film, dress is an important part of telling the story of a painting, for example. And the painting on your right is actually on display in Cardiff Museum. So I would highly recommend that you all go and explore the amazing painting collections in the National Museum, Cardiff. And you get a real sense of just the sheer impact of this painting. And I think this painting really is about dress. It is about fashion, or the fashion of 1874 when the image was painted. So paintings and drawings can give us a sense of what is fashionable, but also about maybe the influence of art on fashion and vice versa. So fashion plates are essentially fashion imagery published in a magazine from as early as the 16th century. But really the heyday is probably the late 18th century and the 19th centuries. So here I've included a quote by the fashion historian Christopher Bruard, and he argues that fashion plates in the 19th century, I quote, represented both an aspiration to the noble life and the practical medium by which dressmakers and shopping decisions could be arrived at. So what Bruard suggests here is that these images had a dual function of hinting at kind of idealised existence and beauty when no one ever looked like a fashion plate. But fashion imagery, really as we know today as well, is consumed as a form of escapism and fantasy. But at the same time, they also served a very practical function of informing women, though also men and children, about styles of dress that they could recreate or have their dressmaker or tailor make. So I've listed here a range of digital archives which contain collections of fashion plates. So if you're interested in this particular form of imagery. Okay, so really kind of a game changer in a visual analysis and visual research is of course the invention of photography. So photography was invented around mid-19th century and very quickly became very popular. And having your photographic portrait taken was also very popular and quite quickly become relatively inexpensive, so it was available to the working classes as well. But there are some issues in looking at studio photography in order to study how people dressed in the 19th century. So first of all, we might think that these images can probably tell us more about how people wanted to be represented and also the kind of conventions of studio photography. The limitations of technology is also an issue. So you may have wondered why Victorians look so stiff and never smile in photographs. So this was because the shutter speed was so slow that you would struggle to maintain the kind of natural looking smile or pose for the time it took to take a photograph. So you had to keep very, very still and very, very stiff. And of course, photographs are black and white, or rather kind of sepia toned. And they were sometimes hand coloured afterwards, but not necessarily to represent colour as it actually was. There's also the issue that photography studios would sometimes have clothing which sitters could borrow, so that sitters themselves could wear clothing that may not necessarily reveal their true social status. So they might have been borrowed garments. And of course, when you go to have your picture taken, you will usually be wanting to look your best or wear your best Sunday clothes or your best clothes. But nevertheless, I think they are highly evocative visual documents which allow us to these kind of glimpses of actual people. And of course, photography develops quickly throughout the 20th century as well. And you have, as technologies progress, cameras become increasingly available and also movable. So you can come out of the studio and into the world. And And so also we have the growth of this, snapshot photography, family photographs as we know it. And they give us sort of similar tangible glimpse of lives that were lived. And you might even have some of these in your family, which you could research and look into. Typically, these images often represent, happy times and special occasions, holidays and ceremonies and such. And so might not necessarily give an insight into the everyday. For example, one of the images here, which is from the Smithsonian Institute archive, which shows two women vacation on a black beach in Maryland, USA, circa 1950. Now, these women look obviously happy, they look beautiful, they're posed on a beach on vacation, but the title hints at something, a much more darker lived reality. So it's very important to kind of go beyond what is simply represented and explore other aspects and kind of social context and the cultural and historical context of these images and how they were being produced. And of course, in the 20th century, we have the development of fashion photography. So as the technology of cameras, but also printing developed, allowed photographs to be printed on the same page as text within magazines. So fashion photography quickly began to, or increasingly began to replace illustrations in magazines and advertising. And the 20th century also saw the rise of the so-called star photographers. So you have these, names such as David Bailey, Cecil Beaton and Helmut Newton. So at this point, it tends to be the photographer who takes the creative credit of a shoot and of an image, maybe despite the involvement of a range of people, so from models to editors and stylists, in creating the image. So I think it's important to be aware that people involved in taking a photograph is not only just the people who are named, and that often there are a range of people who are heavily involved in the output and what the image looks like and how it is shown and where it is shown. And of course, a really important source for research is moving image. So moving image film emerges at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, and very quickly develops as a hugely influential form of image making. So feature films, by which I mean, fiction films, costumes, are first of all there to communicate, character and plot. But they're also an essential part of the visual experience of cinema. So I'm sure you had some moments watching film and television where you were particularly struck by the aesthetic impact of the costumes, and that made the films, highly memorable. But some notes of caution. So when you are looking at fiction film, particularly costume drama, they are not historically authentic. So simply because it's often impossible. So if you are doing an Elizabethan drama, you simply can't get the types of material that they would have worn in this Elizabethan time. So you have to use approximations. So even when great lengths have been taken for historical authenticity, there are usually some giveaways as well in makeup and hair and kind of subtle elements of styling that may not be even noticeable to us in the here and now at the time the film was being made, but can sometimes become clearer as time passes. So usually the costumes and costume dramas can tell us more about the fashion around the time the film was made than when the film was set. So the really great thing, of course, about film is that unlike still images, they show clothing in motion, which of course is how we experience clothing in real life. So clothing is inherently kinetic as it's designed for a moving body. I think documentary film can give us this glimpse of normal people who are wearing their actual clothing rather than those provided by filmmakers. And I'll give you a list of sources and online archives that you can just have and explore, go and look. And often these kind of more unstaged impressions give us a more authentic, perhaps, idea of the kind of style and how clothing was actually worn by people, maybe outside the kind of sphere of elite fashion, which is often what we see. Okay, so written sources. So most of your written sources will be secondary, so academic books and articles and so on. But particularly if you really enjoy reading, written primary sources such as novels, diaries, and memoirs can be fantastic sources. And think about how important descriptions of clothing and style are in a description and the creation of a character in a novel, but also in terms of revealing transformations to that character. So, in his novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, Hanif Kureishi describes the teenage angst and self loathing of the protagonist Karim in meeting with the very cool Charlie. So, I'm just going to read out this quote. I, who wanted to be as Charlie, as clever, as cool in every part of my soul, tattooed his words onto my brain. Levi's, with an open-necked shirt, maybe in a very modest pink or purple. I would never go out in anything else for the rest of my life. While I contemplated myself and my wardrobe with loathing, and would willingly have urinated on every garment, Charlie lay back with his eyes closed and real sartorial understanding in his mind. So in this quote, Charlie's clothing is inseparable from his clever and cool persona, just as Karim's self-loathing is inseparable from his own wardrobe. So my point is that fiction, but also memoirs and biographies, can often articulate more the kind of emotional and transformative qualities of clothing and style that few other sources really can. Okay, so that was actually the end of my list of sources. So now for my final point, which is very important, maybe a bit boring, but that is about the importance of you making a note of your sources and where they're from. That means, so this is the start of really learning to reference. So referencing really is what defines the kind of research we do in a university context. And essentially it means declaring and listing your sources. We're going to do a whole session on this later in the term. So you will learn the particular format that we use, which is Harvard. Some of you might be familiar with it. But I wanted to highlight this already as you're starting to do your research, because it's really important to get into the habit of always making note of the author, the artist, designer, filmmaker, etc., of whatever it is that you're looking at. You need to make a note of where you found it, so which book, if it's a book, an archive, collection, etc. And you also need to make it a note of the year of publication, the year of release, recording, etc. Basically, make a note of as much information as you possibly can. And if it's a website, you also need the URL or the web address. So don't be intimidated, but all this information is potentially also really helpful in building your visual analysis, as you will hopefully see be clear to you in the next session. Okay, so just finally as well, I'm going to include a range of really useful websites, resources, online archives, etc. that you can go and explore. And then finally, of course, there is a bibliography at the end of every presentation.